360 kilometers per hour. That is how fast the new 2026 cars are hitting at the end of the straight. Now imagine this. The car in front suddenly runs out of battery and drops to 300. The car behind still has full electric boost and is closing in at a 60 km per hour difference. Into a braking zone. Max Verstappen has called it anti-racing. He says it feels like managing spreadsheets instead of attacking corners. He warns that if this is the future of Formula One, he does not see himself staying much longer. The FIA says there is no panic. But they already banned low drag mode at the start, restricted the overtake button, installed automatic fail-safe systems on the rear wing, and quietly prepared an emergency power reduction plan if Australia turns into chaos. So here is the real question. Did the 2026 regulations just create the most dangerous speed differential in modern Formula One history? Or is this the painful birth of a new era the sport refuses to slow down? Stay with me, because what Verstappen revealed after preseason testing could force the FIA into the biggest decision of this generation. Now that preseason testing is officially over, the conversation is no longer theoretical. We have the numbers. We have the driver feedback. And we have the internal alarm bells that started ringing in Bahrain. Let's break down what actually triggered this storm. Under the 2026 regulations, the electric motor now delivers 350 kilowatts of boost. That is a massive increase in electrical influence over lap time. At the same time, the internal combustion engine produces less peak power than before. That means straight-line performance is no longer purely mechanical. It is conditional. Conditional on battery state. Conditional on deployment strategy. Conditional on software mapping. When the battery is full, the car becomes explosive. Acceleration is brutal. Drivers describe the exit of slow corners as dragster-like. The torque hits instantly, and the car launches down the straight with terrifying force. But when the battery clips, when that electric deployment runs out, the car does not gently taper off. It plateaus. And that plateau can mean a drop from 360 km per hour down to roughly 360 km per hour difference. On the same straight. That is not a small fluctuation. That is a structural gap. And here is the dangerous part. You cannot see when the car ahead is about to clip. You cannot see its battery percentage. You cannot predict exactly when the power drop will happen. So if you are the pursuing driver, closing in with manual override activated, you are committing to a braking point based on an assumption of speed. If that assumption is wrong by 60 km per hour, the margin evaporates. This is what George Russell described as chasing a moving wall. This is what Verstappen labeled anti-racing. And this is what forced the FIA to call an emergency meeting in Sakir before the first race. Publicly, they insist there will be no major regulation changes before Australia. They say the evidence is still immature. They say drivers always complain during transitional years. But look at the actions. Low drag active aero mode is banned at the race start and during safety car restarts. The manual override activation window has been tightened to 0.8 seconds. Torque spikes are now monitored to prevent unstable engine maps in low gears. A fail-safe system has been installed so that if the rear wing mechanism fails, it automatically snaps back to maximum downforce. Geofencing ensures that low drag mode deactivates automatically before heavy braking zones. These are not cosmetic adjustments. They are protective layers. And they exist because the core problem remains unsolved. The delta speed. Now add another dimension. Braking. The 2026 cars rely more heavily on regenerative braking than ever before. Mechanical brake components are smaller because energy recovery does part of the deceleration work. But if the battery is full, or if regeneration cuts out unexpectedly, the system loses that assistance. The driver is then relying on smaller physical brake discs to slow down from 360 km per hour. That is an enormous thermal and structural demand. One driver reportedly said that if you lose regeneration at the end of the straight, you are simply a passenger. And then there is instability. To reach those headline top speeds with a reduced combustion engine, teams have trimmed drag aggressively. On long straights, drivers report that the car feels light, almost floating. Steering becomes sensitive. Crosswinds push the car sideways more than before. At 360 km per hour, a minor gust feels violent. Combine floating instability with a 60 km per hour closing speed and reduced braking assistance, and you begin to understand why the mood in the paddock shifted from curiosity to concern. Now bring Verstappen back into the picture. He has been consistent. He does not oppose sustainability. He does not oppose evolution. He opposes artificiality. He argues that lifting on the straight to recharge, calculating delta V lap after lap, and timing overtakes around software windows removes the purity of wheel-to-wheel combat. He says if racing becomes a battery spreadsheet exercise, he does not see himself staying long-term. And that is where the pressure multiplies. Because this is not just any driver. This is the dominant force of the current era. He has a performance clause for 2027. If he is outside the top 2 in the championship by the summer break of 2026, he can leave. He also retains a contractual link to Helmut Marko. If Marko departs, Verstappen has an exit door. That means the 2026 season is not just a sporting experiment. It is a turning point. For the regulations. For team hierarchies. And potentially for the future of the sport's biggest name. Australia will now serve as the first true stress test. Not in simulation. Not in controlled stints. But in chaotic, real race conditions. If the delta speed looks manageable, the FIA gains breathing room. If we see sudden power losses mid-straight. If we see aggressive lift and coast phases dominating strategy. If we see instability under braking because regeneration drops out. Then the emergency plan B may no longer be optional. And once you reduce electrical deployment mid-season, you admit the concept needed correction. That is the tightrope Formula One is walking right now. Innovation versus instinct. Sustainability versus simplicity. Software versus driver. The lights will go out soon. And when they do, we will discover whether the 2026 power struggles are growing pains. Or the beginning of a much deeper identity crisis for Formula One. And this is where the story becomes even more fragile. Because once the cars leave the controlled rhythm of testing and enter a real Grand Prix weekend, pressure changes everything. In Bahrain, engineers could plan battery usage down to the lap. Drivers knew when to push, when to harvest, when to simulate traffic. There was space. There was predictability. In Australia, there will be none of that. Picture the opening laps. Full tanks. Cold tires. 20 cars compressed into the same braking zone. Even with low drag mode banned at the start, once the field stretches and deployment begins, the energy divergence starts almost immediately. One driver attacks early. He uses override to gain track position. Another conserves, lifting slightly to recharge. A third miscalculates and clips earlier than expected. By lap 10, battery states are completely different across the field. Now imagine 2 cars approaching the end of the longest straight. The leading car has clipped. It is stuck near 300 km/h. The chasing car still has deployment available and is accelerating toward 350, maybe even 360. The closing speed is brutal. And here is the part that keeps engineers awake at night. The driver ahead might begin braking slightly earlier because he knows he has less assistance from regeneration. The driver behind commits to a later braking point, assuming maximum performance. That mismatch, at those speeds, is measured in meters. And meters disappear fast at 360 km/h. Then there is the psychological toll. Drivers are no longer just racing rivals. They are racing battery curves. They are racing software thresholds. They are racing the clock of electrical deployment. Verstappen's core argument is not emotional. It is instinctive. He believes Formula One should reward courage, car control, and mechanical sensitivity. Not spreadsheet precision at the end of a straight. He has openly admitted that enjoyment is the deciding factor for his future. He does not need more titles to validate himself. He does not need to chase records endlessly. If the sport feels artificial, he has the leverage to walk away after 2026. That possibility adds a layer of urgency to everything. Because the FIA is not only defending regulations. They are defending credibility. If Australia runs cleanly, if the delta speeds look manageable, if overtakes feel organic rather than algorithmic, the governing body can say the transition is working. But if we see extreme lift and coast phases dominating strategy, if we see drivers hesitating because they are unsure when the car ahead will clip, if we see instability under crosswinds combined with late braking into heavy corners, the debate will explode. And it will not remain inside the paddock. Broadcasters will replay speed differentials in slow motion. Analysts will compare 360 to 300 and call it unacceptable. Fans will question whether overtakes are earned or manufactured. And once that perception sets in, it becomes very difficult to reverse. The 2026 era was meant to symbolize the future. Sustainable fuel. Electrified performance. Active aerodynamics. Technological relevance. But the balance between innovation and instinct is delicate. Right now, Formula One is balancing on that edge. Too much intervention, and the championship hierarchy shifts artificially. Too little intervention, and the safety narrative grows louder. And in the middle of it all stands Verstappen. Not just as a champion, but as a barometer. If he continues repeating one phrase, "I do not need to be here," it becomes more than a comment. It becomes leverage. Australia will not decide the championship. but it may decide the tone of the entire era. Because once real racing begins, there are no controlled simulations, no filtered press releases, no softened survey summaries, only speed, only braking, only consequences. And if the delta speed problem appears under full race pressure, the 2026 engine struggles will no longer be a preseason concern. They will be a crisis demanding immediate action. That is what makes this moment so critical. The future has arrived. But the question remains, is Formula One ready for it? And here is the part nobody inside the paddock will say out loud, but everyone is thinking. What happens if Australia confirms Verstappen was right? Because if the first race of the 2026 era exposes visible battery clipping on the main straight, if we see cars arriving at braking zones with massive speed differentials, if we witness even one near miss caused by delta speed, the pressure will not build slowly. It will detonate. The FIA has already made it clear that no major regulation changes will happen before Australia. They insist the evidence is still immature. They believe teams will adapt. They argue that early discomfort is natural in every new era. But they also prepared an emergency reduction of electrical deployment. A quiet Plan B. And once you activate Plan B, you admit something fundamental. You admit the system needs correction. Now imagine the political ripple effect. Teams that built their concept around aggressive energy deployment would instantly lose advantage. Others who struggled with software mapping would suddenly look competitive. The competitive order could shift not because of engineering brilliance, but because of regulatory reaction. That is dangerous territory. Formula One has always been brutal, but it has also been predictable in one sense. If you build the best car, you win. If you miscalculate, you suffer. If mid-season patches begin shaping performance, that clarity fades. And then there is the fan perception. Fans can accept complex engines. They accepted hybrid power units. They accepted the halo. They accepted ground effect. What they struggle to accept is artificiality. If overtakes begin to look like video game boosts rather than earned slipstream battles, the authenticity of the sport is questioned. And Verstappen understands that instinctively. He built his career on raw aggression, on braking later than anyone else, on controlling the car on the edge of adhesion. Now he is being asked to manage kilowatt deployment curves, to think in percentages instead of instincts, to lift on straights to recharge. He calls it anti-racing because, to him, racing is about committing fully, not holding back to recharge a battery. And this is where the story becomes bigger than one season. Because if 2026 turns into a year defined by lift and coast, by delta management, by drivers hesitating before committing to overtakes, it reshapes what Formula One represents. The FIA says this is evolution. They say sustainability demands complexity. They say the cars follow more closely and reduce dirty air dramatically. But following closely is meaningless if overtakes are decided by who pressed override at the right millisecond. The sport stands at a crossroads. On one side, technological ambition. On the other, racing purity. The 2026 engine concept was designed to future-proof Formula One. Yet right now, it feels like it may be testing its limits before the first championship point is even awarded. And then there is the Verstappen factor again. He has options. Endurance racing. Le Mans. A future where he drives flat out for 24 hours without worrying about Delta V spreadsheets. If he repeats, "I do not need to be here," enough times, it stops sounding like frustration and starts sounding like preparation. And losing the dominant driver of the era because of regulatory philosophy would send shockwaves far beyond the paddock. So Australia becomes more than a race. It becomes a verdict. If the race runs cleanly, the FIA can breathe. If we see manageable overtakes and stable braking zones, the narrative softens. But if the broadcast shows one car blasting past another like they are in separate categories, if we see visible hesitation into braking zones because of unpredictable clipping, if we see instability amplified by crosswinds and low drag configurations, the 2026 project enters crisis territory. Because innovation without trust is fragile. And at 360 km per hour, trust is everything. The lights will go out. The batteries will be full. The active aero will be armed but controlled. And within the first few laps, we will know. Was this preseason panic exaggerated? Or did Verstappen just reveal the first crack in the foundation of Formula One's next era?